We welcome everybody to our Bible study tonight. Tonight we're going to begin in Ezekiel chapter 4. And before I begin to give an introduction that goes into my preface of this lecture, we'll just go on and say a prayer. And we'll ask Brother Justin if he'll do that.
Dear Lord, thank you for guiding us here today as we go into your word. Let's just gain knowledge, wisdom, discernment, and overall just grow closer to you, Lord. And just guide us as we read. Amen.
Now, we've reached the point in Ezekiel where we're going to skip around. We're going to look at chapters 4, 5, then we're going to jump over to chapter 12, chapter 24, and then chapter 37. I told you before, we're going to consider every chapter in the book of Ezekiel, but we may not necessarily do it in the order and sequence of one to the end. That may seem strange, a strange order of chapters to look at, but the reason we're going to do it this way is all of these chapters offer the same topic. Enacted parables. Parables that are acted out and not spoken. Do you remember why they were not spoken? Ezekiel was made mute. He couldn't speak for 6 years except at times that God directly wanted him to speak. You know how God stopped his speech? The tongue was stuck to the roof of his mouth. And I guess when he needed to eat, then God would release it. And when God wanted him to speak, if he wasn't sitting at the table getting ready to eat, and you know he wasn't at the table, and his tongue dropped, then that meant God was telling him now it's time to speak. Boy, if God would do that to some of us husbands, we would be in a whole lot less trouble, wouldn't we? Ezekiel spoke parables also, but if you recall, as I just said, God sealed his mouth shut. Chapter 3, verse 26 says that the tongue cleaved to the roof of his mouth. It seems that much of Ezekiel's actions were not spoken out. So it was up to the captives that were around Ezekiel to figure out what he was saying. But what is the most interesting part of Ezekiel's ministry was how these parables were acted out. So it was up, but what's the most interesting part, as I said, is how these parables were acted out. Other prophets had done this before Ezekiel. Ezekiel wasn't the first. But what made Ezekiel unique was the number, the level, and the impact that he did. For example, in 1 Kings chapter 11, there was a prophet named Ahijah who had taken his garments and torn them into 12 pieces and gave 10 pieces to Jeroboam. And this happened during the reign of Solomon. Well, that prophecy he uttered by an enacted parable was that the nation would be divided up. 10 of the tribes would be given to Jeroboam. There was another prophet named Zedekiah. He actually was a false prophet. He was one of the prophets of Ahab. In 1 Kings chapter 22, verse 11, he took some horns made of metal and he fastened them to his head, and he began to push like a bull. And he began to prophesy that this is the way Ahab would begin to push and prevail against Assyria. Nonetheless, we have this man acting out his false prophecy. Elisha, the prophet, also was involved in at least one enacted prophecy. In 2 Kings chapter 19, when King Joash came to him while he was dying, and he was told the king to shoot arrows outside the window, After the king shot 5 or 6 out the window, the king stopped. He thought that's all he needed to do. And afterward, Elisha told him that each arrow represented one victory. So that meant he just shot out 5 or 6. That means he was only going to have 5 or 6 victories. If he would have released all of his arrows, perhaps his future in war would have been a whole lot more successful. And Elisha told him that each arrow represented one victory. The king would have prevailed had he not stopped so soon. Isaiah had an enacted parable. We talked about this several times. In Isaiah 20, we're told he walked around with his buttocks exposed for 3 years. That was to convey the idea that the Jews were going to go into captivity and they would be stripped naked and humiliated and be led away naked by their enemies. Jeremiah had at least twice enacted parables. In Jeremiah 13, 1-14, he took a girdle, he hid it by the river until it was swelled and ruined. Imagine that, women can appreciate that. You take an undergarment and you let it sit out in the sun with the water, with the rain. It gets swelled and ruined. And this represented the ruin of the people of Judah, who had been bound by God like a girdle, but was spilled and ruined. Another one was Jeremiah 19, 1-10, where he broke a clay pot and indicated that it would be also how Judah would be broken, like a clay pot. Also from the New Testament, Agabus, in Acts chapter 21, verse 11, took Paul's girdle and tied himself up with it, hands and feet, and he said, "So shall the Jews bind the man who owns the girdle and deliver him into the hands of the Gentiles." So many enacted parables. But Ezekiel was the duke of enacting parables. We might ask, what is the value of these enacted parables? Why are they enacted? Well, sometimes they're not any clearer than if they were spoken. So why bother going through these actions? Probably the reason is it would have been a more startling impression, and it would be retained better if you see the sermon. I think there's an expression for pastors about that. A sermon seen is better than a sermon heard. You know what that means? Practice what you preach before you preach it. You tend to retain in your mind things that you see visually better than things you simply heard. When there's a visual presentation of something, you take it at a glance, a great number of things that are or can't be ignored graphically. Then you attach meaning to them, and the message they convey will be easier and quicker than a message simply heard. When you see unusual things, it's hard to forget them. If I were to come out here on Sunday morning wearing a rabbit costume, do you think anybody in this church would ever forget that sermon? Probably not. I have no reason to wear a rabbit costume, so don't think it's coming. Jerry Lucas was a Christian basketball player, and he started seminars. He wrote a book on how to improve your memory, and he had a memory device he recommended where you picture in your mind the silliest and the goofiest things that you could possibly imagine, and you associate them with things that you're trying to remember, like a name. If it sounded like 2 other words that related in a ridiculous way, then you do that. Things that are ordinary are easily forgotten. Things that are bizarre and kind of humorous are remembered. This is why Ezekiel was told to do so many bizarre things. We have 2 of the things in chapter 4 and 1 of these in chapter 5. 2 in chapter 12, 1 in chapter 24, and 1 in chapter 37. The subject matter of these, of course, will change. But the reason I take them together is so we can see all the actions that Ezekiel had to do in the course of his ministry. Remember, I said that the first 24 chapters that Ezekiel wrote and prophesied were written before the fall of Jerusalem, which was the first 6 years of his ministry. Therefore, all the enacted parables up to chapter 24 have to do with the coming fall of Jerusalem. Now, let's look at chapter 4. The actions that Ezekiel is commanded to do are very elaborate, so that we would be inclined to expect an elaborate explanation, right? Sometimes the explanation is very simple. Makes you wonder, why do you have to make something so simple complicated? It's better to take something complicated and try to make it simple. But there's a reason why God put this upon him. There's a reason why it was recorded this way. If anything, it's to give us patience and give us more faith. There will be times it will take longer to read the actions that he did than it will be to summarize what he implied by it. Sometimes the elaborate description is used to convey the truth that Jerusalem is going to be deceived, and nothing is more implied by that. So we can appreciate the statement, a picture is worth 1,000 words. It takes more words to explain what he did. Just a general skeletal picture is used to describe the things he was supposed to do, and there are many unanswered questions left as to how he carried some of these things out. The first one depicts the fact of the siege on Jerusalem. He's making these actions at a time when Jerusalem had not fallen and was not deceived yet. There were many false prophets among the exiles who were saying that Jerusalem would neither be besieged normally, and that the Jews who had already been taken into captivity would soon be returning. Jerusalem's message cut across the grain of those predictions, and so he stresses repeatedly the fact of the coming siege and the fall of Jerusalem. The first sign is in verses 1 to 3, and they're the very opening. This is the very opening part of his public ministry. He sat silently for 7 days after receiving the call. That's what we talked about in the first 3 chapters. That's him receiving his call. After he received the call, for 7 days he sat there quiet, taking it all in, trying to figure this out, praying, asking God, I'm kind of skeptical here. I need more faith. I need your help. He was not revered as a man who was a prophet. Do you recall what he was prior to being this prophet? He was a priest. He was of the tribe of Levi. He was a Levitical priest. So he's used to doing priestly duties. He's not used to receiving the word and being the prophet. But he now has a vision of God at the river Kibar. He sat silent for 7 days after this, and in the amazement of those around him, so he began doing these demonstrations outside of his house. He goes outside of his house, and he starts, you remember that game, charades, where you have a statement, and now you got to act it out, and you got to, first word, 2 syllables, kind of like sign language, and then you're trying to describe or acting out what it is you're trying to say for the people to guess. Well, he went outside and did this very same thing, did these very odd demonstrations, and crowds began to gather. Now, you would think if we were to do that today, probably no one would pay us any mind. Why? Because in today's world, we've got internet, and we've got television, and we've got all kinds of things to do in the evening part of the day. But in the evening part of the day back then, there was nothing to do. After you ate, pretty much, you might read and pray together as a family, and you went to bed. But now you see something crazy going on outside. What do you think everybody's going to do? Oh, wow, there's something. What is it? Entertainment here. Let's go see what this what this nut's doing. What is he doing? But yet, wait a minute, that's the priest. The priest is doing it? Why is the priest doing this? Remember, they're captives. So, for many, they probably gathered for the entertainment aspect of it. But here is the first thing he did. Someone, Justin, read verses 1 to 3.
Sure. Now, son of man, take the clay tablet, put it in front of God.
We need a new rule.
Check. Right. Now, son of man, take the clay tablet and put it in front of you and try to slay Jerusalem on it. Now lay siege to it, erect siege, works against it, build a ramp up to it, set up camps against it, and put battering rams around it. Then take an iron hand and place it as an iron wall between you and the city, and turn your face toward it. It will be under siege, and you shall besiege it. This will be a sign of the house of Israel.
Now, he was told to take a tile, or the Hebrew word for tile is brick. Some translate this to be perhaps the brickwork. Perhaps the outward brickwork of his house. On the outside of his house. He displayed this picture on the outside of his house. How much space he had to display all of this, I have no clue. But traditionally, it's believed he took a tile or a brick, he laid it in the sand, and he drew a picture of the outline of Jerusalem. As far as setting speed or forts or battering rams against it. It said he drew those things on the tiles. Maybe he sat up some models. How he did this, we're not sure. But in some way, he portrayed the image of a siege. Then he was to, verse 3, take for yourself an iron plate and set at it as an iron wall between you and the city. Set it your face against it, and it shall be besieged, and you shall lay siege against it. How he did this is not understood. Apparently he took a big metal baking pan, held it between his own face and tile, and now he set his face against it. Now we can't really tell. I'm going to ask Miss Faith if she'll come forward. Maybe he sat there and made mean faces at it. We're not really told how this was carried out, nor are we told how we are to understand the iron pan. Variety of interpretations have been suggested, but most of them are not extremely satisfactory. Some think the pan represented God's protection around the city, and Ezekiel represented the armies that were separated from the city by the protection of God. That would be the opposite of the meaning of what Ezekiel was trying to say. He wasn't trying to portray the idea that God was protecting the city, but that God was going to judge the city. Some felt the iron pan represented God's determined hostility against the city, which is a possibility. But then what does Ezekiel himself represent? Well, there are some who suggest the pan represents the iron, invincible armies of Babylon, and Ezekiel setting his face behind it and against it, and he, representing God, indicates that God was behind the invasion, and he was bringing it on. To my mind, the various interpretations that I have heard suggest that it's most probable as to what Ezekiel was trying to say. The probability that the iron pan represents the invincible army of Babylon coming against the city, and Ezekiel's face being set behind it and against the city would show that behind this invasion, God was actually endorsing it. The next sign he acted out had to do with the length of time that Israel and Judah would be punished. This also, I would say in advance, there are difficulties in this interpretation, but I would have to say they're not insolvable. Then, there's a description a little more difficult to understand. Look at verses, I'm going to ask Gracie if she'll read verse 4. And then, Kathleen, if you want to pull up a chair, you can read too. If you like, you can pull up the chair you're in. You can share a mic with Gracie. If Kathleen will read 5 and 6 and 7.
Lie also on your left side, and when the iniquity of the house of Israel upon it, according to the number of the days that you lie on it, you shall bear their iniquity.
Very good, sweetheart. All right, Kathleen will read 5 through 7.
For I have laid on you the years of their iniquity, according to the number of the days, 390 days. So you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Israel. And when you have completed them, lie again on your right side. Then you shall bear the iniquity of the house of Judah 40 days. I have laid on you a day for each year.
In verse, actually 7 and 8 as well.
Therefore you shall set your face toward the siege of Jerusalem. Your arms shall be uncovered, and you shall prophesy against it. And surely I will restrain you so that you cannot turn from one side to another until you have ended the days of your siege. Also take for yourself wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt. Put them into one vessel and make bread of them for yourself. During the number of days that you lie on your side, 390 days, you shall eat it.
Okay. Now, this particular action, I remember it was probably a year ago, Stan was in the kitchen back there, and he was, I think you all were reading Ezekiel in your personal Bible reading. And Stan asked me about laying on his side for 390 days. You remember that? This particular action consisted of his being bound with chains, laying on one side for a long set of days. Now, as I stated before in our introduction, and I think maybe in the last week or so, I don't know if this laying on one side was represented by sleeping at night for 390 days on his left side, and then 40 days he slept on the other side, but during the day he was not on his side. He was up about doing his other demonstrations and doing his other things. I'm not sure, perhaps that might be what this meant. It doesn't seem likely, since most people don't see him sleeping at night. Remember, these things were meant as signs for the people to see. It was an enacted parable. They had to be able to see it and try to figure out what was meant by it. Therefore, if he was doing it just sleeping at night on his side, it would hardly be a sign to them. What it seems like is he's supposed to be laying on his side all day long, 24 hours a day for 390 days, and then 40 more days on the other side. But after Kathleen read the verse 9, that doesn't seem to make sense either, because there was too many things here he had to be doing. Remember, he was commanded to make the lentil and to cook, prepare food for himself. I don't think he could do that if he was chained up and laying on his side. He couldn't just lay on his side. He had to do other things. Likely he had to do this at a certain time every day. Perhaps he did it for 390 days for like 2 hours in the afternoon. Or 3 hours in the afternoon. He had to come out of his house for a public demonstration, and that the people began to expect this and come to see what he was doing. He did it for 390 days. You came out every day at a certain time, chain your body up, lay on your left side. This would convey the idea of being locked in and having to suffer. I can't sleep on one side all night long, can you? After I sleep on one side for about 2 hours, my side's hurting. I have to roll over. The siege and punishment of Judah and Jerusalem would be pictured, and each day he did this, it represented 1 year. So 390 days represented 390 years. Here, Ezekiel was not relieving Israel and Judah of their suffering, but he was identifying with them. Since the temple in Jerusalem faced east, if you stood facing the same direction as the temple, Israel to the north would be on your left side, and Judah on your right as you face east. Left would symbolize the north and the Jewish mind, and therefore Israel, the right side, would represent Judah, the southern kingdom. Now, each day that he lied there, it said it represented 1 year of punishment. He could not have laid on his left side and right side both at the same time. Now, these would total together 390 plus 40 would total 430 days he did this action. However, in the fulfillment of what he was illustrating, the 40 years of Judah ran concurrent with the last period of Israel. This is about 700 or 800 years before Jesus. Yeah. The two periods ended at the same time. They actually overlap each other in the actual fulfillment. He couldn't portray that. He couldn't lay on the same side at the same time. What are the years that are portrayed here? Well, first of all, this is what you're going to learn. They are rounded off years. The northern kingdom would suffer a total of 390 years. The southern kingdom for 40 years. But they all rounded off. In the case of the northern kingdom, there are many suggestions as to when it began and ended. Some of those theories are entirely groundless, and I will not go over all of those theories. To me, the likely way to understand this, the 390 years of the punishment of the northern kingdom, began at the establishment of the northern kingdom. When Jeroboam took the 10 tribes and set up the gold calf in Bethel and in Dan. And at this time, Israel, the northern kingdom, was alienated from God. They were worshiping gold calves, going back to what they did in the first instance of their existence with Moses. The divided kingdom began in what year? 930 BC. That's when the northern kingdom divided into 10 tribes, divided into their own kingdom. If we consider the end of Israel's suffering taking place at the same time as Israel's suffering, then we would say that is when Cyrus liberated the Jews in 539 BC, when they were able to leave Babylon and go back to their homeland. Now you can tell by simple calculation, 930 from 539 is how many years? 391 years. You might ask, why would we say the northern kingdom suffering would end in that year when Cyrus' decree only affected Judah and the captives in Babylon? It did not affect the Israelites who had been taken to Assyria. Well, to answer to that is that the Israelites who were taken to Assyria captivity, their captivity never really ended. That was permanent. But what's the key word we've learned and studied in all these prophetic books? It's the remnant. The remnant members of the northern tribe who prior to the fall of the northern kingdom had come down and deflected and joined Judah. The Levites who were appalled by the golden calf came back down from the north to join Judah. There were members of all the 10 tribes that came to join Judah, so much so that Jeroboam and the other kings of the northern kingdoms had to set up guards at the border to keep them from going down to Judah. So there were people from all 10 tribes that joined Judah, And when the Babylonian captivity took place, people from all the 12 tribes were represented in that deliverance. That is why, in the days of the New Testament, we see the 10 tribes having some representation in Israel, even though principally most of them were of Judah. When James wrote his epistle, he addressed it to the 12 tribes of Israel. In reality, where was James at when he wrote it? He was in Jerusalem. And he addressed this to the 12 tribes of Israel. Well, if the 10 tribes were all still up in the north, would he be addressing it to them? If all of those members were still up there? No. There was a remnant who was down in Judah. So all 12 tribes were represented. There technically were no 10 tribes left, but there were representatives still left from the 12. So the end of the suffering for Israel and Judah both would happen at the time of Cyrus, releasing the Jews to go back to their land. Otherwise, there is no time that we can picture the end of Israel's 10 tribes suffering, because it was a permanent destruction. Therefore, if not entirely arbitrary and absolutely necessary, that we put the end of the 390 years after Cyrus' declaration in 539. Now, if you subtract those years back, the closest thing you get to the division of the kingdom is 930 BC. What God is saying is that Israel has been suffering the wrath of God ever since they divided from Rehoboam. Now that 391 years is rounded off to 390. And that happened to be the number of days that Ezekiel had to lay on his left side. In the case of the suffering of the southern kingdom, it's a little more difficult because the very first deportation to Babylon was in 605. We studied this in Isaiah. The return from Cyrus' decree was 539. Well, you have 66 years right there between those 2 years. Now, that's not really close to 40 at all, is it? 66. However, we might be inclined to think Ezekiel measured from his own deportation, which would make that figure 58 or maybe 59 years. Still, that's not close to 40. But on the other hand, he may have likely measured from the time Jerusalem fell, which is what he mostly predicted, which took place in 586. 586. Well, the total figure would come to 47 years. If he's thinking of that gap, then it's conceivable he might round that off at 47. He might round it down to 40. Now, in today's math, we would round up to 50. But maybe God was giving the prophet a little bit of leeway there. He rounded it down to 40. Especially considering the symbolic value of the number 40. How many times does 40 pop up in the Bible? It would convey the idea of the wilderness wanderings of 40 years. You consider the 390 years to the 40, you get 430, which is the exact number of years that the Jews were in Egypt. Did you realize that? Therefore, the numbers have symbolic values as well as having a historic fulfillment. He's not being exact in the number of years the fulfillment would take, although we can see it's very close. He's rounded off the numbers, and he did so in such a way as to add a symbolic value. The 40 years is rounding off in his mind to the 47 years there. Of course, 40 conveys a lot of things. And all the judgments seem to be 40. It rained how many days and how many nights? 40 days and 40 nights. The Jews wondered how long? For 40 years. A judgment for not receiving the favorable report from the 2 spies. They spent 40 days searching out the land, and God said, I'll give you 1 year for each day. That's why they wondered for 40. Now, the mathematics are not the easiest thing to sort out unless we appreciate God was not being exact here. He's rounding off the numbers as they are to the value of what they represent. 40 is very significant to the Jews. 430 years would remind them of the Egyptian slavery. Now, the next sign in the act of parable begins with verse number 9. It has to do what he was told to eat. Gracie, I'm going to let you read 9. I'm going to let Justin read a few verses here in a moment. Verse 9, please. Oh, actually, Kathleen already read it, but we'll read it again. Okay.
Also take for yourself 3 barley beans,
Lentils.
lentils, and spelt. Put them into one vessel and make bread of them for yourself. During the number of days that you lie on your side, 390 days you shall eat it.
Now, again, he couldn't lie on the side the whole time, otherwise he couldn't make the food. He couldn't make enough bread, and for that bread to last for 390 days and then do it, right? You couldn't even, bread wouldn't even stay fresh in the refrigerator for 390 days, right? It would still go bad. So, again, I don't think he's laying on his side 24/7 for 390 days. All right. Justin, read 10 through 12.
With 20 shekels of food. Weigh out 20 shekels of food to eat each day and eat it at set times. Also measure out 1/6 of hin of water and drink it at set times. Eat the food as you would a barley cake. Bake it in the sight of the people, using human excrement for fuel.
Okay. Now, this does not mean he added dung to the mixture of the food. Rather, he would use dung as fuel for the fire. Okay? Still, that thought is gross. You know, you can taste charcoal in your meat, right? So if you're using dung to make the fire to cook the food, I don't know if I'm going to be eating it, but okay. All right, Kathleen, read 13 to 16.
Then the Lord said, "So shall the children of Israel eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles, where I will drive them." So I said, Lord God, indeed, I have never defiled myself from my youth till now. I have never eaten what died of itself or was torn by beasts, nor has abominable flesh ever come into my mouth. Then he said to me, "See, I am giving you cow dung instead of human waste, and you shall prepare your bread over it." Moreover, he said to me, "Son of man, surely I will cut off the supply of bread in Jerusalem. They shall eat bread by weight and with anxiety, and shall drink water by measure and with dread."
It would be dread for me. Now, this whole action has two thoughts tied into it. The last verse shows that the fact that he ate his bread, measured and rationed, conveyed the thought that during those siege conditions, there would be food shortages and there would be living under famine conditions. It wasn't going to be a good time for Israel. The amount he ate, now we got all these measurements that we don't really use today, but I'll give it in language that you might understand. He would eat 8 ounces of bread per day. 8 ounces. And a fraction of over 1 pint of water per day. bread and a little less than a pint of water per day. We could hardly live amongst such a thing, right? It seems unlikely that he was only eating that for 390 years. It doesn't seem conceivable that he would survive for 390 days. How he might have, God may have kept him miraculously alive, but this also could have been part of his daily demonstrations. He could have ate regular meals at nighttime when the lights went out in his home, but when he came outside to demonstrate this to the people, this was what he only ate. It might have, in essence, been his snack for the day, is what I'm trying to say. I'm trying to put reality to this. He would measure out his food, and it would convey the idea that this is how they would have to eat. Because remember, Jerusalem hadn't been besieged yet. He's letting them know this is what we're to expect. Go
We
ahead.
have to take into consideration that lentils, beans, millet, and spelt were put into that bread.
True.
That's a lot of nutrition right there.
Perhaps. But still, in areas that are known to be desert, less than a pint of water a day. Yeah.
It doesn't say that's the only it's supposed to eat.
Right, exactly. And that's the point I'm making, is some people think that might be for 390 days, that's all he ate. And it may be he did, and God miraculously kept him alive like he did Moses for 40 days fasting without water and food, and like Jesus for 40 days without. But when Jesus and Moses did it, it was not natural. If we tried to even get anywhere near that, I knew an old Pentecostal pastor who basically did it for about 12 days and it about killed him. It was so bad, his lips busted open. It dried. His lips were so dry, he was dehydrated, and he was on his way to death. Now, he wasn't doing it for a noble reason. He was kind of doing it for a selfish reason, because some people had left his church, and he was praying that they come back because he didn't want to lose the members. And everybody found out that this man's about to die. And I think some of the people came back because they felt bad. Again, I'm not going to go in. I'm not going to really make a judgment there, but some of them did come back, and I think they ended up rushing him to the hospital before he died. No, he didn't die. He died later in a drunk driver hit him and killed him. Later, meaning a few years after that. But again, what's being conveyed here by this sign or this parable is famine, rations, and famine conditions were going to come upon the siege of Jerusalem. And these are the conditions that you can expect to see. Now, then there's another lesson that was in this thing, and here's the one that we might laugh over. He says it was cooked over dung. My daughter was laughing, so I'm pretty sure she knows what that is, right? Okay. To cook over cow dung, which he ended up doing, was not considered an unclean thing, because in the Middle East, they still use cow dung for fuel for fire. But cow dung represented human dung in this situation. Originally, he was commanded to use human dung, and that was a highly unclean thing. Even in our minds, there's nothing more disgusting or abhorrent. The smell, right? God told the Jews in the wilderness that they had to bury their dung. When they were in the wilderness, you knew when the Israelites were in an area because there probably was markers all over. Gosh, there's probably 1 million markers out there. I guess that's where the few days.
That's where the trees are.
Yeah. And that's where today, in those areas that the Israelites wandered, are the most luscious fruit trees. What they did, they fertilized the desert. But the thing was, God walked among them. Remember, He was the fire by night, and the cloud by day. You know, He walked among them. He wanted the dung to be out of the way. Dung represented disease. It represented abhorrence. You know, you can't even go outside your tent and walk into camp without having to watch your feet. That's why they were told to bury it. Now, especially you're wearing sandals and you're stepping and stuff. We can appreciate these things just in what we know of biology. But to bake His bread over human dung was just too abhorrent to Him. Now, I'm going to throw the question in. Why do you think Ezekiel especially was brokenhearted over doing anything that was unclean? What was his profession? Do you remember how many times the priests had to wash every day? How many times they had to change their clothes every day? And if they didn't do things a certain way, they were what? Unclean. If they touched certain unclean things, they couldn't perform their duties. He had spent his whole life being a germaphobe. And now you're going to tell me I've got to eat food that's cooked over dung? Come on, God. To bake His bread over human dung was too abhorrent. And He objected. And you know what? God felt His pain. So what did He do? All right, I'll let you use cow dung instead. But still, the cow dung represented human dung, and the idea was that the Jews would eat their defiled bread among the Gentiles where I would drive them. This carries the idea, in addition to the lesson, that they would eat under the siege famine rations, and adds the thought that while they're in Babylon, they might even have to eat unclean foods. But it's interesting, remember Daniel and his 3 friends, they were right there in the presence of the king, but they still did not eat. They did not defile themselves with unclean food. They would not be able to go to their kosher deli and meat markets while they're in Babylon. Jews had to have their meat specially drained, and the blood had to make sure there was no blood in it. They had to make sure their meats, but this was before Jesus came, that their meats were not sacrificed to idols. They didn't want to have communion with any type of idol worship. In Babylon, if you're eating meat, you don't know if any of that happened. Did it properly get bled? Had they used this in some type of sacrifice? The point is, they would not be able to live a kosher life while in exile. Now, in verse 9, where it gives the ingredients of the bread, he was to use wheat, barley, beans, lentils, millet, and spelt, and put them in one vessel and make bread. Now, most bread was made of wheat or barley. But the other things were hardly considered ingredients for bread. The idea is that under famine conditions, people would not hold out for ordinary bread. You know, like Kate right now. Kate loves dark bread. You know, or the what's that? What is it?
Pumpernickel.
Pumpernickel. Is that how? Say that again. Yeah. I think that's the weirdest. It's like Piccadilly. Or Pickle Signer was one of my doctor's names one time. But, you know, but now Kate's having to, you know, if she's really hungry, like she was the other day, she had to eat white bread. You know, when you're about to starve, you'll eat sausage and white bread and be happy you got something to eat. But this is what's conveyed here. You're not going to be under your ordinary comforts, your comfort food. what you feel is right with you and God, you're not going to be. That convenience is not going to be there. They'd have to take anything that they could get and ground it into flour and use it because of the shortage of food. I've heard of people talk about, have you ever heard of the Ezekiel 4:9 bread? Years ago, they sold bread by that name, and it was made with these ingredients. Now, Health Nuts has said this bread is so nutritious that a person could live 390 days eating this bread alone. And they understood that is how Ezekiel lived. They realized there's no sense that the chapters conveying that this bread is healthy or that it was sustained life comfortably. It didn't say anything about that. This, in fact, portrays famine conditions. It's not portraying a healthy life. It's intended to portray inferior food, eaten because better food was not available at the time. We're not sure. Well, yeah, are they going to cook it over? Maybe they're going to put cow dung in their grill. I don't know. We're not sure that Ezekiel did survive on this food long. Maybe it was the dung that gave it a better taste. We need to stop. But either way, Ezekiel had to prepare his food when he was demonstrating his actions. It would be measured out. It would be prepared over dung. It would be famine rations. And it would be prepared under unclean conditions. That's the whole point of all this. We're not given a recipe to make a bread that's supposed to be a master nutritional value, system. That's not what it's for.
So the uncleanness of their food represents separation from God.
Very much so. All of it is represented. Remember in Israel, God said it before them. Moses told them, choose today. Do you want the blessing or do you want the malediction? If you hearken to my voice, if you listen to what I'm saying, if you keep this covenant, I will bless you when you go in. I'll come in. I'll bless you when you go out. I'll bless you from your head to your toe. Everything you touch, I'm going to bless if you hearken to my voice and if you keep this covenant. But if you don't hearken and you don't keep it, you're going to be cursed in everything that you do. You're not going to be blessed with cleanliness. You're not going to be blessed with disease-free. You're not going to be blessed with the convenience. You're going to be miserable. And all God's doing is showing them to reap what you sow.
What they do, we got to why don't they eat certain foods back when they're the law was because I think I should work really clean compared to everything because that's how it was served.
Right.
Because they were sacrificing and eating and the way they prepared it would cost. So there's physical and spiritual ones.
Exactly. And because really, if you look at it, when it talked about the hoofs and feet, all of that, if you look at that, what it means is they were only allowed to eat meat that were vegetarian. Any animal that ate other animals who might have been diseased, they couldn't eat that meat. They couldn't eat a pig because a pig will eat anything. It don't eat meat. It eats vegetables. It eats rotted stuff. It eats dead stuff. It ate everything. They certainly couldn't eat a buzzard because that's all buzzards do is eat, unclean things.
When you think about it, what they thought they were restrictions actually turned blessing.
Right. And the thing about it, too, is remember, this was a time before conventional ovens. Science has taught us that if you're going to eat meat that, like pig, that eats anything, you need to at least have the inside of it at 360 degrees in order to kill the enzymes that are inside of it. once the enzymes are killed, it's safe to eat. Science has taught us that. Well, if you're living outside using campfires, unless you're doing logo like they do in the islands where they dig a hole, they wrap it in banana, they put the lamb or whatever inside of it, wrap it in banana leaves, put some type of other shield upon it, cover it with dirt, and cook it in the ground. Unless they knew how to do that, and even still, there's no guarantee that the temperature would exceed 360 degrees. You know, now we have microwaves, now we have conventional ovens. So that's why mostly anything we eat today is not unclean to eat. It's not unsafe to eat it. As long as we cook it long enough and cook it hot enough, we're good. But the Israelites, you know, they didn't know all this. We only know it from the hindsight. And we know it because what science has taught us over the years. But these were the reasons behind these things. It might add also, did you have another point?
Yeah, I was saying, you know, here just goes to show what happens maybe once you eat something, there's a reason behind it, it's a lesson to show you.
That's exactly right. I mean, the reason we know with true certainty why fidelity to your neighbor was always a command in Scripture. And even the Bible talks about not bringing a defilement to your marriage bed. When you go out there doing other things in other places and you bring that mess home, disease. You know, it's not just an emotional and mental thing. It's a physical thing. You may have contaminated yourself, and now you're bringing the contamination into your home. You know, He always knew. Us stupid humans didn't always know, and we're still learning. And even though we know it, sometimes we're still stupid. But, like Justin said, there was always a blessing in every command He gave. I might add also that where He objected to humandom, in verse 14, it said there again, I, Lord God, indeed, I have never defiled myself from my youth till now. I've never eaten what died of itself or what was torn by beasts, nor has an abominable flesh ever come into my mouth. Abominable flesh, according to Leviticus 7:18, this is it is, was food that was kept for more than 3 days without eating. They considered that an abominable food or an abominable flesh. Now, we appreciate the health reasons now. Now, we can go more than that because we have freezers and refrigeration. Right? But without refrigeration in the wilderness, eating food left out would be an abominable, especially to the priests. Ezekiel was a priest. The devout ones would keep themselves from eating such things. Therefore, it broke his heart that after all these years, his lifetime of maintaining a strict kosher diet, from his childhood all the way up to his 30th year, that he'd have to break his diet now. God honored the scruples of the prophet. He told him to use cow dung instead of human dung. You might remember a similar situation, although some of the principles were different. In Acts chapter 10, Peter was on the housetop in Joppa. Remember this? God showed him a vision of unclean animals being lowered on the sheep and told him, you want to, I didn't write the exact verse down. I forgot to do that. In Acts chapter 10, you see where it says arise and eat? Acts chapter 10.
See, and a voice told him, get up here, kill and eat. Surely not, Lord. Then a voice told him, Get up, Peter, and kill and eat. Surely not, Lord. Peter replied, I have never eaten anything impure or unclean. The voice spoke to him a second time, Do not call anything impure that God has made clean. This happened 3 times, and immediately the sheep was taken back to heaven.
He's told to go and eat. Peter said, from my youth up, just like Ezekiel. You know, I've never done this. Now, Peter was a much older man than Ezekiel was at this time. But the Lord didn't let Peter off the hook either. He let Ezekiel off the hook. Why? Why didn't he let Peter off the hook, but yet he let Ezekiel off the hook? Okay. The point was, what Ezekiel did was before Jesus. Before Jesus, what was still intact? The law of covenant. After Jesus, was there any law of Christ that forbid what you could eat? That's the reason why Peter wasn't let off the hook. In fact, the Lord was making him do this to let him know, hey, there's a new rule now. You're sitting here looking at the Gentiles who are becoming believers and looking down at them, thinking they're unclean because they're not trying to keep a diet that you've kept for your whole life. Some of them haven't been circumcised. And you're looking at them like they're second or third rate citizens. The citizenship in the kingdom of God, you're all number 1 A rated. There's not no second rate, third rate, fourth rate. We're all first rate. So Jesus was making a point here. He would not modify the command as he did for Ezekiel. Ezekiel lived under the old covenant. He was commanded to eat what would be unclean. He could not eat it. He didn't want to violate that. That would be an unkind thing for God to do, is for God to ask him to break his own commandment. It'd be inconsistent for God to do that. Perhaps this whole thing was a test. Maybe he said, I want you to do it with human dung. And if Ezekiel said, okay, maybe the Lord would have stopped and said, oh, look, yeah, I didn't tell you to do it. But no, you're a priest. That's unclean. Does that kind of remind you of something we did in Sunday a couple of weeks ago? Abraham was told to do something that God really didn't want him to do. It was a test. Right? Perhaps this was a test for Ezekiel. Maybe God intended on Ezekiel objecting.
In the New Testament, too, we have to remember that God said they could eat of any kind of food in the mission of their work.
Right.
And it would not harm them.
Right.
Their food no snake bites either.
That's right. Exactly. And in Peter's case, he was holding on to Jewish scruples that were no longer valid. Peter was still eating kosher even though the law had been fulfilled in Christ. And when Jesus died and rose from the dead, it was very clear that none of the laws about the kosher diet needed to apply any longer to Christians. God was trying to tell Peter what he considered unclean is no longer unclean. Because now God was accepting Gentiles. So that's the difference. Well, I think that's a good stopping point. In fact, we should have probably stopped 10 minutes ago, but that's okay. Next week it'll probably take another hour to do the remaining chapters of these parables, these unspoken parables, enacted parables, that is, Ezekiel 5, Ezekiel 12, Ezekiel 24, and 27, or 37 is what we're going to do next week. Are there any questions? Okay. If not, we'll close with a word of prayer, and Pastor Kathleen, you can do that and use that microphone.
Lord God, thank you so much for still we are able to meet together and study your word. We are so grateful that we can go through your word and figure out what it was that you were trying to teach us, to tell us, and especially inform us what the jobs of the prophets were and what they did to try to help God's people. And we just thank you and praise you and give you all the honor